As the morning mists drift away, dispelled by the rays of the new day's sun, Exbury Gardens awaken to a chorus of exultant birds. Here, on the edge of the New Forest, is one of the wonders of the world, a unique garden that vies with the lost beauty of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The story of these gardens is the story of one man's single-minded devotion to a dream of creating a fantasy world of breathtaking beauty. He was Lionel Nathan de Rothschild, a member of the illustrious banking family. Here he created a place of pilgrimage for the flower he loved above all others. His garden was to be a celebration of the rhododendron. He fell in love with it as a man might fall in love with a bewitching woman, and remained faithful all his life. A love of flowers is something that is innate in man. I've been a keen amateur gardener myself for many years, so I can well understand the enthusiasm and dedication that Lionel de Rothschild put into creating this garden. I'd like you to come with me on a journey into a realm of consummate beauty. It's a journey through 60 years of history. Not history written in words, but history written in flowers. More's the pity that all history could not be written in flowers. Exbury Gardens are situated 100 miles southwest of London on the Hampshire coast, near the busy port of Southampton. They're protected in the lee of the Isle of Wight from the roughest weather that sweeps off the Atlantic. Here the air, warmed by the very tongue tip of the Gulf Stream, laden with moisture, provides a microclimate of balmy dampness ideal for growing rhododendrons, the flowers for which the gardens are world famous. Here, too, the great forest oaks are provided lime-free leaf mold to give the acid soil composition essential for rhododendron cultivation. Exbury was conceived on an audacious scale. The 250 acres of dappled woodland, crisscrossed with over 20 miles of pathway, are planted with over 1 million rhododendrons. Visitors who walk through the gardens are treated to dazzling displays of color, while surprising vistas open themselves up as the paths weave here and there among the trees and onto a succession of ornamental ponds. The imposing neo-Georgian house that Lionel built is the hub of this great horticultural endeavor. From this centerpiece, it took 20 years for the web of paths to spread out to the remotest corners of the gardens. The glass houses were originally built to house a fabulous collection of orchids, camellias, and tender tropical rhododendrons. Here, Lionel nurtured the vast number of hybrids of all kinds, for which the gardens are justly famous. If there are gardeners who are born, not bred, Lionel was one of them. He was a gardener with one overriding passion for the rhododendron. The present owner, Edmund de Rothschild, is Lionel's eldest son. If his father was a born gardener, Edmund was a bred one, although in his case the manifestation of this breeding took a long time.
When I was young, I took no interest in the gardens. My father was so interested himself that he took upon himself to do everything in the gardens. And even my mother wasn't able to partake with him except to take visitors around the gardens. So as a young boy, I wasn't really interested. Though flowers didn't interest me very much before the war, when I was in North Africa, in Tunis, the flowers, wildflowers there were particularly beautiful. And I do remember laying down in a field and counting 27 different varieties of wildflowers that were surrounding us. Then at the Battle of Cassino, in the beautiful evening, May evening, the nightingale sang most beautifully, and the scent of the flowers around was absolutely lovely. When I came home after the war, my mother and the then head gardener, Freddie Winard, used to go round, and sometimes I found that there was too much beauty in the gardens. Having sort of gone through the war and seen the most terrible destruction, sometimes I felt that at weekends, when the gardens were almost at their height of glory, that somehow or other I just didn't want to go in, and I didn't go in. It was very curious, that. I can't quite make out why I didn't want to. But then gradually it grew on me, and more, and now I love going round. You must talk to a plant. I feel somehow or other it's like when you talk to your dog. If you say to your dog, good dog, what a lovely boy you are, well done, the dog will wag his tail. If you say, bad dog, oh, you're naughty, it will cower. But that's exactly the same. Or whenever I see a particularly beautiful flower, I say, what a beautiful plant you are. I'm so pleased you're well, or pat it on the trunk and say, good show almost. It doesn't really matter. It's just the voice carrying, the voice of appreciation. My father, he used to take hold of a plant that didn't flower, and he used to shake it and talk to it and say, you must flower. Then if it didn't flower the next year, he would prune its roots so as to give it a shock like a baby. And then, after one more year's trial, if it didn't flower, he would dig it up and burn it.
Lionel was descended from Nathan Meyer, founder of the English branch of the Rothschild family. He and his 4 brothers, each based in a different European capital, established the family's preeminence in international banking at the time of Napoleon. Within their lifetime, the Rothschilds became one of the most powerful families in Europe. As the century progressed, the English branch of the family, like their European relatives, aspired to the aristocratic lifestyle to which they felt their wealth entitled them. In England, it was a question of finding total acceptance in a land where, as Jews, they had risen to the very pinnacle of society, and as such indulged in all the pastimes that mark the upper classes, breeding Derby-winning racehorses and owning one of the finest hunts in the land. Brothers and cousins vied with each other to build grandiose palaces, each more sumptuous than the last. One of the most extraordinary homes was Halton in Buckinghamshire. It was built by Lionel's somewhat eccentric uncle, Alfred. In its studied opulence, the smartest dinner parties in England would be serenaded by his own orchestra. The musicians were chosen not so much for their musical abilities, but because they were all of the same height. As part of a complicated deal between Lionel's father, Leopold, a keen follower of the hunt, and his elder brother, Alfred, Lionel would inherit Halton. The family eccentricity also showed itself in Walter, the second Lord Rothschild, Lionel's cousin. He was the only man who ever drove a team of zebras 4 in hand down Piccadilly. But he also had his serious side. Few, if any, zoologists during their lifetime have had so many living creatures named after them. It was undoubtedly from Walter that Lionel developed his interest in horticulture. Lionel's other interests included photography, at which he excelled. He took these pictures of his father, his mother, and of Mary Louise Beer, whom he subsequently married. He was one of the first amateurs to experiment with movies, a hobby with which he would keep his friends entertained for the rest of his life. As a young man, he'd been an ardent motor racing enthusiast. He sustained this interest until the introduction of shock absorbers, which, in his view, took the fun out of the sport. His friendship with John Montague, father of the present Lord Montague of Beaulieu, and their common passion for motor car and boat racing brought him to the neighborhood of Exbury. Lionel decided to settle close to his friend and bought a parcel of land and a house at Inchmerry on the edge of the Exbury estate, once owned by the Mitford family. He moved here with his wife in 1912 and started his masterwork of hybridizing rhododendrons, creating new colors and hardy strains suitable for the English climate. When the First World War broke out, Lionel was a major in the Bucks Yeomanry. He expected to join his unit for immediate active service, but to his bitter disappointment, he was not allowed to go overseas.
There were only 3 elderly Rothschilds left in the family bank, and King George V decreed that there must be a Rothschild left to run the bank, and my father was told to stay behind, so he never actually fought in World War I. One of his brothers was killed, and the other one, my Uncle Anthony, was wounded. He came back and ran the bank with my father. After the war ended, my father always felt at a disadvantage amongst his friends, and so he withdrew into himself and devoted himself to creating the gardens.
When his uncle Alfred died in 1916, Lionel inherited Halton. But it was a house that he'd always disliked, and so he sold it, and with the proceeds he bought the whole of Exbury estate. He used the shell of the existing house to build his own. He intended to have a place in which he could entertain in true Rothschild fashion. It was typical of him, in rebuilding the house, to make every effort not to damage a magnolia tree that had stood there for many years, where most men would have chopped the tree down, albeit with regret, Lionel designed his new house around it. As senior partner of N.M. Rothschild and Sons at New Court in the City of London, he worked a rigorous 5-day week, but at the weekends he sped down to Exbury to indulge his greatest passion, the gardens. He described himself as a gardener by profession and a banker by hobby. It was 1921, and the site was overgrown with an admixture of trees and undergrowth struggling for breathing space. Work on the garden began after Lionel had rebuilt the house. One of the biggest initial tasks was clearing the site. An estate yard was built as the base for the army of men who were employed to systematically clear the tangled woods. The hamlet of Exbury tripled in size to become the village it is today. Lionel built a bakery, the village shop, a laundry, and a social club to provide facilities for the influx of population connected with the expansion of the gardens. Lionel shot this film during the construction of the garden. Thousands of saplings were uprooted and the undergrowth torn out. The unwanted trees were taken away in cartloads so that the plants which Lionel had chosen would have space and light. At the same time, he designed an arboretum, a tree garden in which he intended to plant every type of tree that could be grown in Britain. With characteristic directness, he had his men blow holes with dynamite to prepare the ground for planting. Lionel could never be accused of not thinking big. He built a railway through the woods as they were cleared, with its own miniature engine and rolling stock. The railway's main function was to carry rocks for a future rock garden of more than 2 acres in extent. It took 4 years to finish the rock garden alone. It was to be a home for plants that grow at high elevation in the Himalayas and Chinese mountains. Huge rocks were carried in to make this one of the biggest rockeries ever built. Regularly, during the planting and flowering seasons, Lionel used to organize gardening weekends. Eminent horticulturalists were invited to proffer advice on whatever problem was exercising Lionel at the time. Life at Exbury was idyllic. It was a haven from the rigors of London. Those who came there never wanted to leave. The gardens were at their best, renowned as a unique phenomenon. In just 10 years, Exbury had become a garden fit for kings. King George V and Queen Mary were the first royal visitors to call. The Prince of Wales arrived in his private plane, which landed in a field in front of the house. His brother, Prince Albert, the Duke of York, and his wife, Elizabeth, came to stay just before his accession to the throne. Many years later, as the Queen Mother, Elizabeth planted a tree during one of her visits. The King of Sweden did likewise. The stream of distinguished visitors has continued to the present time. Lord Mountbatten, who lived nearby, often called, bringing his friends. Queen Elizabeth II has twice visited the garden. Like her mother, she also planted a tree. She took snaps for her family album. Some of the loveliest rhododendrons in her own gardens originated here. But there were other visitors, a singular breed of men, who had captured the imagination of their generation. These were the plant hunters. Every major garden in the world is indebted to these extraordinary men who travelled in remote regions, often in appalling and dangerous conditions, to gather plants. Lionel de Rothschild was one of the most avid supporters of expeditions to Asia, and a good many plants now to be found throughout the Western world were brought back first to Exbury. In those days, Tibet, one of the major hunting grounds for new species of rhododendrons, was virtually cut off from the outside world. There were no roads into it from India. The only way of making the journey was by pack animal over the roof of the world. When the explorers reached the foothills of the Himalayas, they were astounded at the carpet of rhododendrons, stretching as far as the eye could see. They ranged in size from dwarf plants that clung to the cold heights to giants of 60 or more feet high in the valleys below. For the plant hunters, this was Shangri-La. One of the most renowned plant hunters, Captain Francis Kingdon Ward, who went on over 20 expeditions to some of the most dangerous and least accessible parts of the Himalayas, was a frequent visitor to Exbury, where he could see the fruits of his labor nurtured to success. He wrote in his journal, "Rhododendrons in the wild, lashed by the mountain gales, caressed by the sun, or stung by the driving rain, in winter, buried under 10 or 20 feet of snow, are unforgettable. Man can assemble in close embrace a far greater range of rhododendrons than nature knew, but never can reproduce the drama of living plants in the high and lonely passes of the Sino-Himalayas." Whether this sentiment was true or false, Lionel de Rothschild was determined to have a damn good try. Discovering the plants was one thing, getting them back was another matter. Great care had to be taken to remove the seed and transport their specimens home. Men who went out there to bring plants back to British gardens risked their lives daily. As if threat to life and limb were not awful enough, Tibet at that time was primitive and suspicious of foreigners. Often the plant hunters were in danger from the mistrustful Buddhist priests, who were ruled by the Dalai Lama. The priests found it hard to believe the white travelers when they said that they had come halfway across the world to collect plants, which the Tibetans themselves used for firewood. Tragically, several of these plant hunters gave their lives, so that new species could flourish in English gardens and throughout the Western world. If you come to Exbury at the peak of the flowering season in May, you will be dazzled by the enormous profusion of rhododendrons of many shapes and sizes and colours. The plant is characterized by such variety that for many years experts believed that the more extreme forms were separate species. Later it was proved that they were all part of the same Ericaceae family. Rhododendrons and their subgroup azaleas are an exotic genus of primitive plants descended from the giant tree magnolias. They had their primal beginnings many millions of years ago in the eastern Himalayas, and only a dozen hardy species were to be found in North America, and only 2 in Europe. As new species were discovered and brought to gardens like Exbury, not all took kindly to their new surroundings. It was necessary to develop new varieties that were more suitable to local conditions, and to improve colour and scent. This is done by crossing 2 varieties, or in more technical language, hybridization.
For hybridization, we choose 2 plants so that we can try and combine the best characteristics of both. I usually get my head gardener to select the parents. He must choose a closed bloom to ensure that pollination has not already occurred. The petals are then carefully removed. The pollen-bearing portions are cut out, leaving the stigma exposed. The anthers are then selected from the male parent, and the pollen is dabbed on to the stigma of the female parent. In the wild, of course, all this is in the hands of the birds and the bees.
The excitement of hybridizing comes from its very uncertainty. Because it is a sexual method of propagation, one can never be sure that the cross will turn out possessing the precise characteristics one would wish. It's like 2 people having a child. Who can predict with certainty what the child will look like?
In a hybrid, one looks to make it more beautiful than the parents. I know the parentage of my son Nicholas. I'm the father, and I know who his mother was. But the flower, well, that's a different matter. We know one of the parents, that is Ponticum, the common purple European species, but the humble bumblebee is the only one that knows the other parent. As a flower opens, you wait with expectancy to see something, especially if you have made the cross and it is flowering for the first time, then it's most exciting.
What appears to be effortless beauty is in fact the result of Lionel's endless experiments. He condemned tray after tray of seedlings to the bonfire in his efforts to find perfect plants. He made 1,210 crosses, of which 462 new varieties he deemed worthy of naming and registering with the Royal Horticultural Society. One of his finest crosses, Naomi, which he named after his youngest daughter, is said to have everything a rhododendron should have. It's a splendid, sturdy, well-filled plant with nectar-laden, scented flowers of the utmost charm, which it produces with opulent generosity. Naomi, in turn, crossed with Kingdon Ward's finest discovery, Rhododendron wardii, gave Idealist, which is considered one of the most beautiful rhododendrons ever raised. Lionel was equally successful, crossing Naomi with Campilocarpum to give Carita, another of his most inspired matings. Lionel was never to see some of the most brilliant creations which his genius had conceived. Hawk variety crest, one of the last crosses he made, did not blossom until the early 50s, some 10 years after his death. It was the purest yellow ever produced up till then in a woodland rhododendron. Lionel was above all the master of landscape. He knew how to create the illusion of height and distance within a confined space, how to get the best out of each fold in the land. He also understood the importance of foliage and how the variation of leaf, shape, and color could as much enhance a particular view as the great banks of color. Why have one plant where a bank of 50 would do the job so much better and give the eye a solid display? Whether in the wild or in a man-made garden, the rhododendron is a thirsty plant. In their natural habitat, many of the plants get up to 80 inches of rain a year. No place in the south of England could compete with that. Certainly not Exbury, with its lower than national average rainfall. What nature does not provide sufficiently, man must. Lionel built an elaborate system for watering the gardens. He erected a water tower that holds 2 huge tanks, each containing 20,000 gallons. They can spread the equivalent of 1 inch of rainfall over an area of 2 acres. Lionel dug boreholes to a depth of 270 feet to tap sweet water that drained into the Bewley River. He laid 26 miles of underground pipes to water every section of the garden. They're linked to sprinklers. by surface pipes which are moved regularly to ensure that every part has water. Lionel poured enormous resources into his garden. Luckily, he never had to count the cost, for the cost was uncountable. If naming plants is a privilege, winning trophies is the ultimate accolade. It is an accolade that has often been bestowed on Exbury blooms. Lionel and his fellow horticulturalists competed annually for beautiful cups that each had donated to the Rhododendron Society. Since the ownership of these cups is only for the brief period of 1 year, Lionel had sterling silver replicas made as a monument to his triumphs. Lionel's most coveted award was the Victoria Medal, given in recognition of his unique contribution to horticulture. In the interwar years, Lionel enjoyed the gardens through spring and early summer. But with the flowering season over, he took to his motor yachts. Lionel's favourite yacht, which he characteristically named Rhododendron, was built at a Solent shipyard. Each year he sailed to a different part of Europe, but his favourite location was the Adriatic. Lionel was basically a lonely man. He communicated with people by sharing his enthusiasms rather than his emotions.
My father was a very austere man, and he was a very shy man. He liked his children, he was nice to us, always very distant. He was quite strict, and I must say that I was always a little frightened of him.
Lionel gave his son Edmund a cine camera on his 21st birthday. Edmund very soon immersed himself in the fun of filmmaking, building his own impressive film archive, which he's been updating ever since. In the late 30s, he took his camera on a world tour. The record of his travels is more than just a home movie for family gatherings. It's a view of a world long since gone. Edmund could not make such a trip without visiting the Himalayas to see for himself the natural home of the rhododendron to which Exbury owed so much. Edmund returned just before the outbreak of the Second World War and rejoined his regiment, the Bucks Yeomanry, the regiment the Rothschilds traditionally served in. He took his camera when he embarked for France and captured these scenes of the ill-fated British Expeditionary Force. France was in the grip of a hard winter, and Exbury gradually became a distant memory. He was supremely aware, as he headed for the front and the immediacy of war, that however the war was to end, things could never be the same again. Edmund returned to a New England after the war. Although he had foreseen it, he was still ill at ease. Exbury was now a very different place. The old family house was deserted. During the war, it had been requisitioned by the Admiralty and used as a headquarters for planning the Normandy landings, and has never been lived in since. Lionel had died in 1942. Luckily, Edmund had been at home on a brief leave just a few months before and took these pictures of his father. It was the last time they ever saw each other.
When I went back home, my first leave was, of course, the late autumn of 1945. I'd been overseas for more than 2.5 years, and therefore didn't see the garden beginning to flower until 1946. And in 1946, there was an awful lot to do, my entering the bank and trying to get the estate into some sort of shape. The Navy was still in the house. I walked around the garden, and it struck me as being very beautiful and very fine. And then came the idea, well, look, after all, death duties, I've got to pay so much money that what am I going to do? Am I going to just live in a suburban house and have beautiful things around me and give up Exbury and probably not even raise enough money from that to pay death duties? So I just took the decision and thought, well, the best thing would be for other people to share this beauty.
He was assisted by a fellow officer, Peter Barber, who had joined him at Exbury as his estate manager during the formative post-war years.
It was an immense task to rebuild the gardens, because in the 5 intervening years, they had become overgrown. There were many dead branches, many trees had fallen down, and then, of course, new crosses had sprung up. They had to be identified, labelled, and named.
He decided to develop the garden in new directions.
At Exbury, there are also many varieties of azaleas, both evergreen and deciduous. Now, my father made more than 1,200 different hybrids of rhododendrons and azaleas. By careful crossing of the Naphill strain of deciduous azalea with other species, he created the Exbury azalea. After the war, we raised a hardier and tighter trust type, which we have named the Solent range of Exbury azaleas. Like the Exbury strain, they vary tremendously in colour. My favourite is a butter yellow one, which, when Princess Margaret visited the garden, she graciously allowed me to name it after her, Princess Margaret of Windsor. It will always be a new garden. What we've done is to cut out a lot of the old plants because they die. But when they die, they must be replanted. So we have brought on young plants, some from seed, some from scions, cuttings, layering or grafting. And what pleases me is to know that the Exbury plants are in so many parts of the world, even in areas where the species originated. We've planted up new areas of the garden and brought back old ones, and now the gardens are in their prime. What I've tried to do at Exbury is to give enjoyment to as wide a section of people as possible. Some 50 to 60,000 people a year come to see the gardens between March and June. There are those that like gardens, those that just like to walk and ramble, and not necessarily to know anything about plants, but just like the sheer beauty and listen to the birds and the humming of the bees. I hope that the memory of what my father created has been kept on, and that it will also be kept on by my sons.
Clear had the day been from the dawn, all checkered was the sky. Thin clouds like scarves of cobweb lawn veiled heaven's most glorious eye. The wind had no more strength than this, that leisurely it blew to make one leaf the next to kiss that closely by it grew. The flowers, like brave embroidered girls, looked as they much desired to see whose head the orient pearls most curiously was tied, and to itself the subtle air such sovereignty assumes that it received too large a share from nature's rich perfumes. As one takes an early evening stroll around the garden, one cannot help feeling the presence of the man who turned a wilderness into one of the most beautiful woodland gardens in the world. Rudyard Kipling must have been inspired by an achievement such as this when he wrote some of his most famous lines. "Oh, Adam was a gardener, and God who made him sees that half a proper gardener's work is done upon his knees. When your work is finished, you can wash your hands and pray for the glory of the garden, that it may not pass away. And the glory of the garden, it shall never pass away."